Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this last session of the day. It's a really big privilege to moderate this discussion on what the digital services revolution means for development. My name is Rem Korteweg. I'm with the Klingendaal Institute in the Netherlands. And again, it's an honor to moderate this terrific panel. So as you'll have noticed, one of our speakers is still due to arrive. He will be coming soon, we know. So bear with us. So in the program, if you open it on your smartphone, it says what the shift to digital services means for the world. And then when you click the program, it says what the digital services revolution means for development. So we're going to take the liberty to talk about both of these issues and to kind of expand not just about what digital services means for development, but also for a number of key regions around the world that are going to sort of set the tone on digital trade policy. So we're going to make these connections as we move along through this panel. Now, also, you'll note the two banners on opposite ends of the platform. This panel is organized with the proud support of Jennifer Hillman's Center on Inclusive Trade and Development, as well as in the context of the Global Trade Series. The Global Trade Series is an initiative of 11 think tanks worldwide that aim to provide a platform for discussion and a podcast for insights on the economic and political dynamics shaping trade. And we've been doing this over the past 4 years with the support of AIG, under the proud stewardship of a certain Rodri Williams, who can't be with us here live in the room, but is joining us online. So a big shout out to Rodri wherever you are. So according to the WTO's data, digitally delivered services have experienced a fourfold increase in value since 2005. Astronomical, you might argue. In 2022, digitally traded services accounted for 54% of all services exports worldwide. And amid concerns that global trade might be slowing, digital services trade seemed to be the bright spot or the exception. And we want to test whether that's indeed true. Is it true that digital services trade is different, that it is the exception? Is it, for instance, immune to some of the other pressures we see throughout the global trading system, like geopolitics or the risks of fragmentation or regulatory competition? And how are different regulatory approaches dealing with digitally traded services, and what does it mean for global trade? We also want to touch on the question what role the WTO can play in terms of harmonizing regulatory approaches to digital services. There is, of course, also initiatives like the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, the moratorium on e-commerce, which I'm sure we'll also explore. We also want to raise this question, coming back to the title, what does all of this mean for development? So to make sense of this, we have four fantastic speakers. One of them, Richard Baldwin, who I'm sure will show up very soon. He is, of course, he needs no introduction, but is, of course, Professor of International Economics at IMD in Lausanne, as well as connected to the Peterson Institute. To my immediate left, Jennifer Hillman, who's Professor of Practice at Georgetown University. She is the co-director of the Center of Inclusive Trade and Development, and needless to say, also a former official on the appellate body. Then to my immediate right, Jane Drake-Brockman from Sydney. Great to have you here. Jane is Executive Director of the Australian Services Institute. And then to my furthest left, not extreme left, is Emily Jones. And Emily is the Director of the Global Economic Governance Program at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. So the rules of the road for this session are that we've divvied up these different topics amongst the four speakers. They'll each speak for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then there will be a second round where I ask them questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Unfortunately, we can't get questions from those joining online. And I guess then you should have made the trip to Geneva. So why don't we get started with you, Jennifer, if I may. In the United States, of course, is home to major global digital companies and platforms, and because of that, has a massive influence over where digital trade is going. But what role is or isn't the United States playing in this field? And if you can throw in afterwards some thoughts on how this connects to the broader dynamic, which we also see in digital services trade, where there's more regionalization taking shape, and what this means for the Americas particularly, by all means. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ram. And I want to thank everyone for being here. And I want to thank the AIG Global Trade Series for its support for this panel and for some of the work that we're doing at the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development. For those of you that might not have listened to the AIG Global Trade Series podcast, I highly recommend it. They are lively, they are informative, they are timely. So again, if you haven't done that, it's one of the better podcasts out there talking about trade issues in a very informative way. So just a little plug there. So I had been expecting to follow Richard Baldwin, and he would have been telling you about the incredible growth that we are seeing in digital services and what that in part means for the degree to which global trade and services is going to become more time zone oriented, which means those of us in the United States are going to be trading more on these digital services with our colleagues to the north in Canada, and again, then throughout Latin America. So I wanted to then turning to digital services and look at the situation in the United States, because we are clearly in a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, the U.S. is absolutely a global leader in creating and exporting digital services. But at the same time, the U.S. has pulled back from a leadership role in shaping the digital rules of the road. And I think both of those have really important implications for this conversation. When you look at U.S. participation in the global markets, services represent the really high value added activities in which the United States does maintain a global advantage. While the U.S. has been running a fairly significant goods trade deficit, our services trade surplus in 2023 topped $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, dollars, the highest on record, with a services trade surplus of $278 billion. So the sort of good story in trade, to the extent that there is one in the United States, is almost entirely what's happening in services. And much of that services trade surplus comes from the growth in digitally enabled services, meaning services that are predominantly delivered over information communications technology networks, with the U.S. heavily engaged in everything from from licenses to computer software, to cloud computing and storage of data, to royalties for industrial designs that support manufactured specialized equipment. I mean, if you step back and look at it, 8 out of 10 of the largest digital companies are American. I mean, think Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Disney, Facebook. So again, from a private sector perspective, you know, US companies clearly dominate. And if you look at this growth of digitally enabled services, our exports in that category have far outpaced growth in other services or growth in goods. So again, I look at US real GDP grew 1.9% in 2022, but the US digital economy grew by 6.3%. And the majority of that extra growth really came from software and telecom services and the like. So you would think with all of that growth in digital services and how much the US is a leader, it clearly means that the US needs international cooperation and fewer restrictions on barriers to digital trade more than anyone else in the world, you would think. And yet, what's happened is what you've seen is the United States really pulling back from being that leader in driving the generation of the global rules for the road in digital trade. I mean, for starters, we saw the United States withdraw its previous support for proposals on data flows, data localization, source code, and non-discriminatory treatment of digital producers that was part of the Joint Strategic Initiative on e-commerce. Then this summer, the United States declined to sign on to the draft, what is referred to as the stabilized text on an e-commerce agreement, citing, you know, concerns related to privacy and security exceptions. And then the US suspended support for similar provisions that were to have been included in its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, negotiations. I think it's fair to say when you look at it that this pullback from our prior leadership position caught many in the United States, particularly in our telecom sector and these large business corporations, a bit by surprise. So why? Why is the US pulling back? I think it's important to just sort of think about that. Part of it is, and the statement that was made by the United States Trade Representative was that we needed to provide more policy space for debate to occur in the United States. And the bottom line being that the United States cannot be out here on the global stage advancing a certain approach to digital rules when there is no consensus within the United States on what those global rules are. We don't have the equivalent of the EU, privacy rules. We don't have the equivalent of a Digital Markets Act. We do not have those rules. And the problem is there's not a consensus within our Congress. We don't have a particularly functioning Congress. So the idea is, wait a minute, let's take a pause, while the United States thinks about its digital policy. And obviously an open question here is, how long is the rest of the world supposed to wait for the United States to get its act together? So again, a huge issue there. I would say the situation in the United States is complicated not only in the US, but in many other parts of the world, because the trade and the commerce and the economic agencies are not the only ones involved in writing digital rules. Just as we've seen a blurring, I would even say an erasing of the line between economic security and national security in goods, you have clearly seen in the digital area, you're seeing increasing attention to the link between trade and digital services and concerns over cybersecurity and all of the national security issues that go along with that. So when you step back and again look at it from a US perspective, it's our State Department, not our Commerce Department, not our trade officials that have begun advancing, as they did in 2023, a national cybersecurity strategy. But it's interesting to look at what that goal of that national cybersecurity strategy is. It is to forge international partnerships to build an open, resilient, defensible, and rights-respecting digital ecosystem. So you see right in the mission of this cybersecurity effort, this blending of trade and digital services, rules around digital services, and the issues around cybersecurity, data security, cyber resilience, which again, they would describe as the prerequisites and enablers of economic growth and healthy, civic spaces, with, again, the U.S. really actively engaged in trying to foster partnerships to counter and respond to malicious cyber operations, cybercrime, and other digital harms. So then just, again, because this is more of a regional focus, as we're going to hear from Richard. Richard, thank you. And our apologies that we needed to go ahead. So if I step away from it and focus on what I think Richard is going to tell us, which is a lot of this trade is now going to start to be sort of oriented more around time zones. And I look at what's happening in the rest of the region around which the United States is centered, there's a lot going on, but it's creating, again, a lot of these distinctions. So if I look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, what's happened there? Just less than 2 weeks ago, the United States brought the beginning of a challenge to Canada's imposition of a digital services tax. So in the summer of 2024, Canada institutes a 3% tax on revenues related to online marketplaces, online targeted advertising, social media platforms, and user data. So 3% of all the revenues that come from any of those things, but the tax only applies to companies or groups with global annual revenues of more than 750 million euros. So again, guess who that targets? Let's go back to that list of who are the top 10 producers of any of those things. 8 out of those 10 are the United States. So again, the United States is saying, whoa, 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 this is totally discriminatory because you're only going after the big players. All the big players are American, therefore you're discriminating against America, therefore you're violating the USMCA. So just coming soon is going to be, again, the real bringing of this conversation about whether or not taxing digital services can be done, where, when, and how without discriminating. If we look then at what's happening south of the border, what we see fundamentally is Mexico becoming very increasingly relevant for nearshoring, as that term has been said, the desire of U.S. companies to move manufacturing closer to the U.S. market and to take advantage of all the privileges that come from being a party to the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, and to make sure that their supply chains are being established in and around the USMCA region. But the problem for many is that Mexico is really a much less digitally mature market. And you're also seeing the increasing presence of Chinese imports into Mexico, which then again raises all of these national security concerns about how much we're willing to do with Huawei's presence, the Chinese company Huawei's presence in the IT market. If you step further south then in Latin America, just to close it out quickly, there are, again, some clear leaders within Latin America in the digital services space. At the top of the list would be Brazil, Argentina, and Costa Rica, where you do see, again, a very significant amount of information and communications technology exports. It's accounting for 23% of Costa Rica's exports, 7% from Argentina, 6.5% of all Brazilian exports are in these sort of digital services areas. But when you look at, and again, you see U.S. big tech, again, investing heavily in Latin America. I mean, Google just announced this past week that they're putting in their second big data center. This one is going into, they have one already open in Chile. I believe this one is going into Uruguay or Paraguay. I need to check. So again, brand new investments, but you also, again, are seeing this big presence from Huawei and other telecoms countries. A much less robust regulatory environment within Latin America in terms of around digital, with Brazil being the exception. I mean, Brazil does have, its own equivalent of the Digital Markets Act that very much mirrors what the EU is doing, and a comprehensive set of obligations. So bottom line, very dynamic leadership, U.S. leadership coming largely from its private sector. On the regulatory side, the U.S. kind of stepping out of that role.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And just before we go to Richard, can I ask a question? Because you've highlighted the EU a couple of times, also in relation to what the number of countries in South America are doing. Canada, in certain respects, how important is what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic in terms of driving the debate, that policy space that U.S. officials want to create for a discussion on digital trade policy? How important is what other regulatory areas are doing in this domain?
Well, from my perspective, it's extremely important, and that's partly because the EU is so far out ahead of the United States. Between the EU's Digital Markets Act and the EU GDPR, the EU has a very well established, again, privacy regime, now a very well established markets regulation, and the U.S. companies have to, do a lot of their services to those EU standards, because otherwise they're heavy players in Europe as well. So Europe is driving the regulatory bus, and the longer the US stays on the sidelines or not even getting on the bus, the more they are going to have less to say about how those rules are being shaped. But no question, right now, our companies are all having to completely comply with and more or less follow what the EU has established as some of those basic rules.
Terrific. Richard, great that you're here. I've lost an illusion that Swiss trains always run on time. So it's fantastic to have you join us. We started off with Jennifer, giving a broader expose about what's happening in the US. I'd now like to turn to you to sort of walk us through what the main global trends are in terms of digital services trade. I highlighted that from the WTO's perspective, there's been a fourfold increase in value in digital services trade since 2005. In 2022, digital services accounted for, 54% of all services exports. Is digital services sort of the bright spot in a, for the rest, kind of somewhat gloomy global trade system?
How long do I have?
Take 5-6 minutes.
I do have one slide. By the way, the trains weren't messed up. It was me who was messed up. I got off at the wrong place. Yeah, okay. The thing is that, well, never mind. Okay. So thank you very much for that. I won't use the slides right away. So please look this way here. It's the interesting thing about a panel like this is an economist like me essentially assumes all the stuff Jennifer was talking about is like a non-issue, doesn't exist. So I like, oh, that's just all, small costs or whatever. But of course it is, and we may end up with a fragmented thing. But so I will maybe comment on the next round about it. But what I want to do is as Rem said, talk about the role of how the future of trade is services and how that's going to lead to change in development strategies and what that could mean for world patterns of trade. So I'm going to start with 3 facts that I think are decisive when you think about the role of services in world trade. In particular, export-led development. I'm going to be focusing on emerging markets in my comments here. Although, and in generally speaking, I'm thinking of the rich countries as the buyers and the emerging markets as the sellers. Right now, as you may or may not know, 2/3 of all sales are from rich countries. So right now they have the comparative advantage, but that's changing. And I'm going to argue that it's going to continue. So the first fact is it's harder to grow your exports of manufactured goods, but easier to grow your exports of services. Now, there's 2 very good reasons for that. First of all, the world demand for manufacturing imports is stagnated in 2008, but not services. That's the left graph there. Now, you don't have to look at me. Please look at the graph for 1 second. So this is like a tennis match here. What you can see there is I've got plotted the evolution of the value of the export worldwide of goods since 2009, I think that is 2090. I'm sorry, 1990. I put them both at 100. Now obviously goods is much higher than services, but I put them both at 100 so you could see the trends. And what you'll see is globalization in goods. As you've heard, the globalization is declining or plateaued or whatever. That's talking about goods. The orange line is services. There is no slowdown. It is growing as fast now as goods were growing in the heydays of the 90s. So services, the demand for these things is growing. The demand for manufactured goods is not. The second point is that China dominates the export of manufacturing. It dominates manufacturing, full stop. So it is very difficult to match the agglomeration scale economies they have, especially if you're trying to get into it. The vast majority of emerging markets manufactured exports are facing increasing competition from China and are often shrinking. That's not true in services. There is no hegemon in services. There's nobody ahead. And scale economies aren't very important, so it's easy to get in to start with. There's really three ways to get into it. There's a business processing outsourcing, which is a way where relatively small and medium enterprise start becoming like part of the back office for firms in advanced countries, usually, like say a Bogota HR firm will be doing HR for a firm in Miami, often very retail, very low level. Then there's global service centers, where a large multinational corporation will essentially set an offshore office building in, say, Buenos Aires, which is a high education, low wage country, at least in Buenos Aires it is. And so everybody in that building works for Amex. All the computers are owned by Amex. All the data centers are owned by Amex to control everything. It's just like an offshore factory going from Detroit to Mexico, except it's an office building. The third way is freelancing, and that is something that's growing very fast, and almost anybody get into it, but it's still fairly small potatoes. The second dominant fact is that emerging economies' share of world services exports is low, but growing faster than that of rich countries. Since 2016, at least, it's growing much faster, and for good reasons. The first two reasons I'm going to talk about is, think about this trade as telework from abroad. You're all familiar with telework. If you believe telework is going to stay and grow domestically, you also believe that telework internationally will grow even more. The basic point is digital technology is making it possible, and all the adjustments the G7 firms have made to allow telework domestically are making it easier to slot in foreign workers. The second is enormous wage differences. In many countries in this world, as many of the people in the room here know, $10 to $20 an hour affords you a middle-class living. If you work $10 an hour for 2,000 hours a year, you're getting $20,000 a year. Did I get that right? That's a middle-class income in most countries in the world. And if there's two of you, it's more. If you're getting $30, etc. So the gains from offshoring office jobs to emerging markets is much larger than the gains from offshoring production of goods to a place like China, because most of those gains have been arbitraged away. I just gave myself another 6 minutes. Is that okay? Sorry about that. Okay, but I think everybody's having fun. So the last point is that manufactured export-led development is dying. So if you look at the share of countries who had the value added in their exports growing faster than their GDP, so in some sense, the value added in their exports was leading growth, that was about 70% before 2008 in manufactured goods. Now it's about 20%. But on services, it's exactly turned around. Now about 70% of all emerging markets see service export-led growth happening right now. That's a simple fact, and it's going to continue. So let me give you a forecast with a conjecture. Why the future of trade is going to be services, and therefore also development. First of all, the barriers to services are much higher than the barriers to goods right now, something like 100 or 1,000 times higher. Second, the barriers to intermediate services, this is B2B, are technological, not policy linked. There are virtually no barriers to the export of intermediate services. I have one of the world's exports here. She's going to correct me a little bit, but very few. Remember, India did its entire export boom in services without signing a single free trade agreement. And that was before services were really into the WTO. So there are no barriers. It was by mistake, but there are no barriers. It's very hard to tax. And digital technology is lowering those technical barriers at an explosive pace, like cutting them in half every 2 years. The demand in rich nations is huge, since about a third of all gross spending in rich countries is on intermediate services. And the capacity already exists in emerging markets because they're already doing that for their local firm, often using exactly the same software. Simultaneous speech translation and Gen AI will increase the substitutability of domestic and foreign workers in an important way. And therefore, I think that service exports will continue to grow and will soon start to dominate world trade flow. Soon could be, in 10 years or so. When you're an economist, you make a forecast, they say, give a number or give a date, never both. So, there we go. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much, Richard. That was absolutely fascinating. And just one follow-up question, so you have 2 more minutes. Why is the pressure of fragmentation not something that we should worry about in the services domain?
So actually, I forgot the other slide. So the other slide was what Jennifer actually mentioned, was that because this is services, it's basically telework, and it's much easier when the teleworkers are in the same time zone. So my belief is the emerging market miracle will continue and spread. And now, for the first time, Africa and South America will come along for the ride. They missed the global value chain. So unless they were in commodities, they didn't really enjoy this whole emerging market thing. So now South America will, I think, provide the back office services for North America. I think Africa will provide it for Europe. And I think Southeast Asia will provide it for Northeast Asia and also Oceania. So that's an important thing, bringing Africa and Latin America into global value chains, but these will be service global value chains. And the intermediate services I talked about, that's joining a value chain. You sell to another business who uses those inputs to make a thing. So service value change is going to be a thing. Now, why isn't the geopoliticals? People are just fascinated with manufacturing, and all the discussion is about stuff you can drop on your foot. It's except the cybersecurity thing, the Huawei, a few things like that. But a lot of those are also connected to hardware. And in any case, most of what we're talking about, this other commercial services, has no geostrategic, bottlenecks or choke necks. It's people processing CVs, it's bookkeeping, it's designing stairwell blocks in buildings, it's doing, scheduling medical, it's all sorts of back office things that don't trigger the China hawks in Washington. So there are, of course, a couple of examples like TikTok maybe getting blocked, or many of the American services are blocked in China, but it's not a major source of tension. And I just think that people in the US and the China are really focused on manufacturing, maybe partly because it can be so concentrated that they're, when we talk about back office services, there's plenty of substitutes. So you're never going to get caught in a war without being able to process CVs or something like that.
Thanks so much also for this dose of optimism about where global trade is going, at least in this domain. We're going to go back to sort of the regional perspective. We had Jennifer talk about the Americas and the United States. I want to give Jane now an opportunity to share with us her thoughts on what's driving the debate in Asia, pretty sizable piece of the world. And Jane, please give us your thoughts about what we should be focusing on when it comes to digital trade policy.
Thank you, Rem. Well, I thought Richard would have advertised his books by now. And so he did write a book in 2019, The Globotics Upheaval, which argued, rather as Richard has argued here, but it actually had quite an impact, particularly in developing Asia. And so did the book before, the earlier book in 2016. In fact, it found a fairly immediate audience, even in the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, which had just been formed and had its first public-private dialogue. And I think you were its first speaker, and we even got you to do it online, which was remarkable. Now, if we go back a little bit, in that same year in 2019, UNCTAD launched the first data really on this in e-commerce week here in Geneva, showing that online services transactions were completely dwarfing e-commerce for goods, and estimating that for digital trade, GVC B2B activity was already back then 6 to 10 times larger than B2C activity. Now, that was an extraordinary result, and it was in the services side. And this kind of vindicated Richard, and and it also showed that early UNCTAD data showed that knowledge-intensive business services was the thing to watch. So a couple of years later, the Asian Development Bank set out fairly explicitly in their preface to test what they called the Baldwin hypothesis. They wanted to look for any evidence of this new trade opportunity and explore what regional governments in the Asian region needed to do to enhance the prospects for developing Asian economies to prosper. It was a groundbreaking piece of work. It was probably the first one out there in the literature that was explicitly labeled a study on digital services. And the ADB did in fact find conclusive empirical evidence consistent with Richard's postulations that the Asia-Pacific region's greatest opportunities for increased growth in trade now lie in the services sector. So those ADB results were important, and while they're slightly out of date now compared with the latest data, they're worth rehearsing. The ADB found after a decade of rapid growth, the region by 2022 was already the world's second largest exporter of services after the EU. And this ranking held also for digital services that were growing faster than non-digital services. And while starting from a lower base, obviously, they were growing faster also than in the rest of the world. Now, East Asia, largely due to China PRC, accounted for over half the region's digital services trade. But already then in 2022, its export share was dropping, with South Asia, largely meaning India, and Southeast Asia on stronger export growth paths. In Southeast Asia, Singapore accounts for the lion's share of the trade, but the strongest overall growth story was the Philippines. Now, digital services export growth was found literally everywhere in the region, in the Pacific, in Central and West Asia, in Oceania, and several developing countries. I'll never forget some of the data. It was really extraordinary. Annual average growth in services, digital services, exports, Myanmar, 27%, Timor-Leste, 16%, Lao PDR, 14%, and then a long row of 11% growth figures for Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia. It's sort of obvious in some ways when you look back at that data why Myanmar and Lao PDR are participating in the JSI on e-commerce. But right across the region, business services were dominant. And I mean dominant, like 70 to 80% of the digital services exports we're talking about. The exception was India, where telecoms, computer, and other ICT services were equally important, sort of 50, 40, 60. And financial services, fintech, e-payments was a growth story everywhere. Several economies in the region had already emerged as digital services import and export hubs. China PRC, India, Japan, Hong Kong, China, Republic of Korea were the most dynamic. And as Richard said yesterday, potential for Bangalore's galore. I like that. But policy action was identified as needed to bring down the barriers to digital services trade. And the ADB study actually offered a lot of advice. A regulatory environment that strengthens digital trust and facilitates cross-border business connectivity is pretty fundamental and a good place to start. Digital trust, trade facilitation, I mean, it's interesting looking back at those words and watching where things have evolved. This requires explicit government focus on digital trade and engagement in international digital standards development, active participation in negotiations around digital trade governance, engagement in digital regulatory cooperation in the interests of mutual recognition and interoperability. So since then, and I think it's pretty evident to everyone, regional players, especially in North and Southeast Asia and Oceania, are active bilateral, regional, plurilateral and multilateral players on every single one of those fronts. Initially, of course, the sway the bilateral FTAs in the region, and I'd sort of call out in a way the ASEAN +1 FTAs, a lot of them, and they're big agreements covering all of ASEAN with another player. The mega RTAs such as CPTPP and RCEP, and then the work that quietly went on behind this with APEC and the US involved in that work. We're just talking, not negotiating, but figuring a lot of things out, particularly in standards kind of areas. It's a very ASEAN thing to want to do, to talk things out for a long time. And in the region we have. I guess DEPA was a bit of a breakthrough. It was certainly noticed by the international community, along with the whole string of Singapore's DEA, digital economy agreements, if you like. And the one I know best is the Singapore-Australia agreement. I mean, basically taking out that rather, well, is it or isn't it an old-fashioned thing? The old e-commerce chapter in our FTAs, which most of us have had for 20 plus years, taking it out, looking at it, rethinking it, turning it into some more comprehensive new piece of legal architecture, calling it a digital trade agreement, and in the process, covering not just those trade facilitation issues like digital trust but going on and really handling cross-border data flows, data protection, privacy, committing to joint regulatory sandboxes, work on cybersecurity standards, work on, in our case, the ethics of artificial intelligence. And Japan's agreements, similarly, you see them going in the same sort of direction, and then Singapore and Japan and other players like Korea, Australia and New Zealand also reaching out to partners beyond the region and taking with them some of that experience. And I guess DEPA was important because it did, again, it tried to show the importance of soft law approaches, of establishing platforms for collaboration, of principles-based agreements, of even best endeavors, because what we're talking about is new, and it requires more than one economy to get it right. So and the latest agreement, of course, that's being negotiated is the ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which is very interesting in itself and is following the same sort of template, highly comprehensive sort of agreement. And then here in the WTO, Asian players were big supporters of the JSI on services domestic regulation, and again, now all three co-conveners of the JSI on e-commerce come from the Asian region. And what is that agreement doing? Again, building digital trust in the economy, facilitating trade in digital services, all the focus on paperless trading, e-identity, e-authentication, e-payments. Early days in some of those areas, but they're all in there. And providing the principles around regulatory digital regimes to try and encourage more cooperation and engagement together in multi-stakeholder digital standards organizations. You see the principles-based, the soft law encouragement sort of language in there. Stage one, I mean, a start in building a global baseline agreement for digital trade. And the remarkable thing is that we now have in that stabilized text, it's been out there for everyone to read for a couple of months. We now have a template out there for everyone to see. What are we talking about when we talk about we need digital rules of the road? So look, I'm happy to come back on more issues, but I know you probably want to move on.
I mean, this is great. Also sort of highlighting how important Asian economies have been to drive this agenda, not just regionally, also in the context of the WTO. And we'll get to a follow-up question later about, well, how do we put the WTO in position to actually deliver on some of these things that you already see happening, which you so eloquently described at the regional level. But given sort of the good news story, if I may call it that, from Asia, I now want to turn to the European theater and ask Emily, when you listen to Richard and Jane and Jennifer talk, what's the UK approach to this? Because it seems that the UK is still in a phase where it's trying to figure out how to formulate its sort of post-Brexit trade policy. What role does digital trade play in that? I can imagine that it's sort of caught between different regulatory behemoths and it's trying to play a role of its own. So very curious to see where you where you see the UK coming out on this.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating set of presentations. Let me just explain. So I think the UK is in an interesting place. You've mentioned there, Richard, the very rapid growth in digital services, and you too, Jennifer and Jane, and that's absolutely been the case for the UK. So as you know, it's not particularly easy to measure. We're still trying to estimate exactly digital services trade. But what the OECD report last week on the UK's digital trade, the latest data we have is from 2020, so it's a little bit out of date, but even then, digital trade accounted for half of total UK exports. So again, like other countries, we've now got a situation where digital services trade has grown much more rapidly than non-digital services trade, as well as trade in goods. Yeah, that's the numbers, and that's over half the or double the intensity of the other countries they studied, and higher than all countries except I think Ireland and Luxembourg. And that reflects the services intensity of the UK, particularly its exports. So for the UK, it's more the areas like financial services, insurance, the business processing, etc., which have digitalized very quickly. And I think the UK is also in an interesting place because it's got a very high level of digital connectivity. So it's been the move by the government has been to try and make the UK sort of hub in the digital global economy. We've got one of the highest levels of data center clusters, commercial data center clusters globally. And we've also got, I think, close to 60 submarine cable connections. So we've digitalized rapidly. We've also got a relatively high number of AI companies. So it's an interesting, so the pivot post-Brexit by the previous administration was very much to try and make the UK a sort of digital centre. And that's absolutely shaped the UK's digital trade policy agenda. So we've negotiated with the EU, but I think as you'll have seen, there's a lot of the UK's activity has been with other partners. So we've had free trade agreements, particularly with Australia and New Zealand, but I think the one that really stands out, and they all have extensive digital chapters, it's the UK-Singapore one that is particularly extensive. So if you look at what's in the UK-Singapore digital economy agreement, so it's been framed as a standalone digital economy agreement. It's actually replaces the old e-commerce chapter so it's a bolt-on to the underlying UK-Singapore FTA. And when you look at it closely, at the time, it was negotiated sort of 18 months ago now. It had more provisions on digital in terms of scope than any other digital agreement to date. So it's very expansive. So it includes a lot of the source code provisions, a lot of the data flow provisions, as well as a lot of commitment on regulatory cooperation that we've seen in other recent agreements that Jane has talked about. Often, I think, imported from other agreements, but certainly it's an expansive agenda. And that was very much, as you've mentioned, Jennifer, from sort of what the US perhaps might be doing, but the UK has been looking to sort of break down barriers to its digital services exports. It's been very much sort of looking at protecting the intellectual property of its companies, as well as then trying to avert regulatory fragmentation. And yes, I think you've mentioned does fragmentation matter? Maybe not the big geopolitics, but I think fragmentation at the level of regulation of data flows and data privacy, of AI. AI is increasingly embedded in services. So the more you've got divergences, you can see it's an issue. So I think there's a push to get greater regulatory cooperation so that at least there's communication and hopefully some convergence. Of course, it's interesting because we're right adjacent to the EU. The EU's moved incredibly quickly, which begs the question of to what extent the UK can meaningfully diverge from the EU. There, I think, on the issues like data and data protection, we've largely aligned with. So we have the GDPR domestically, and I think in practice it's quite hard to diverge for all the things you were mentioning, Jennifer, that the large companies have to converge with EU standards. So it's very hard, I think, in practice to then really diverge from that. But I think if we step right back from this, and I work in a school of government and public policy, if we look at that, where we're going with the trade policy agenda, there is some real disquiet for me. So I think we've really focused on promoting the digital services, but I think there are some big areas from a public policy perspective we've neglected, and I'm going to highlight two very briefly. One of them is the increasing concentration in digital markets. So not necessarily the digital services markets. I think you've mentioned, Richard, they're quite contested markets, so financial services, etc. But if you look at the underlying platforms that are enabling, right, these digital services, we're seeing ever increasing levels of concentration. So the data centers, the submarine cables, then the platforms, you know, that underpin. So I think there's a really interesting question of how do we address increasing concentration in digital markets. In AI, for example, AI innovations happening among very, very few players. Even the AI startups are very dependent on the data sets and the compute that are handled by very few. So I think there's a really interesting question at the international level to say, if we're going to have a very robust trading system, there's some pockets of, I think, of vulnerability that are building up. So if you look at the discussions among financial services regulators at the Financial Stability Board and others, they're worried about the systemic importance of some of these platform companies for financial services, for financial stability. So I think there's a conversation to be had then about market dominance and how do we have healthy, robust, competitive digital markets. Another one I think is a really interesting set of tensions we're going to have to really work through. And we've seen this around now calls to regulate artificial intelligence and on very good reasons to do that. And here, if you look at the source code provisions, and if you look at the way we drafted them, for example, in the early digital trade agreement, so these are provisions that essentially governments are committing not to require companies to disclose their source code and algorithms, except under very narrow sets of circumstances. And of course, now with turning to regulate AI, we're precisely saying, well, we would like you to open the black box so we can just check that what you're doing is robust. And I think what we're now seeing in the latest round of digital trade agreements, including the one with the UK and Singapore, is they're having to build out the exceptions, because we're suddenly realizing that we haven't allowed enough space to then regulate in the ways that we might want. So the big challenge, I think, in some of these spaces is making sure we're joining up the trade policy agenda that moves to ensure we're protecting intellectual property with some of the discussions about how we regulate emerging technology. So a much, I think, closer dialogue between the trade community and the digital community nationally, as well as internationally.
Terrific. So we now go to the quick fire round, and then you'll have noticed a number of the speakers have asked you also questions or comments on your presentation. So I want to start with you first, Richard, to either address some of the points that you heard, but perhaps I can frame them a little bit as follows. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, when it comes to the development potential of digital services, you sketch a very optimistic picture that this is where the main trend line is going. Are there any things that we should be thinking of to harness its potential even more? Should we not be worried about sort of regulatory standards and competition among standards, sort of putting a brake on this trend towards more and more digitally delivered services? And I think that goes to the point also that you raised, that most of the barriers are technological, not political. Well, that's true, except if you look at AI, for instance, or data privacy, that's where political things do really come in. So I'd like to ask you to comment on that a little bit. And if possible, Jennifer, in her opening comments, also mentioned that digital services trade is very much time zone sensitive. So how is this a global story, and is it not really a regional story?
Okay, so I'm not going to answer most of those. I think that this is not a silver bullet. Think about it. You've just discovered a copper mine, but the copper mine is a bunch of skilled people in the capital city who are going to generate some foreign exchange and start an upcare. And it's up to the government to spread that through the economy. Just like with a copper mine, there's going to be relatively few people working in it. It's going to bring in a lot of foreign exchange, but it could be the backbone of a launch, like in India. So that I'm not going to go into that. And UNCTAD has a lot of discussion about how to do that and what to do. What I'd like to do is ask a question, which raised a set of questions, which was raised by what you were saying. And that is, I wonder if we don't need some additional classification or quantification. So Jennifer, you mentioned the problem of having Huawei things and going over. How much of a problem is that for? How much of other commercial services is something we'd worry that Huawei was listening to? And is there any way we could segment, for instance, medical services that go over the wire and other services? Or is this really, we have in mind a very small number of services and flows which we would worry about Huawei getting hold of? Or is it everything? And the same thing with the cable, underground cables. That sounds scary. I didn't realize that. Although there's a lot of concentration in shipping as well, and airlines as well. So it's not something we haven't seen before, but it would be interesting to quantify that, to see how important it is. Is it, what's flowing over which platforms, and just to get some dimensions on it. And then the other one, which is kind of, we touched about privacy. I wonder what share of the world's trade in exports, service exports, is something we would worry about the privacy with, or the security with. Is that a lot? Is it a little? So maybe to kind of classify the services according to the vulnerability to platforms, the vulnerability to regulation, the vulnerability to national security issues or privacy issues. So just that's my question.
And would you imagine the WTO to do that classification, or is that up to think tanks or the G7?
Well, this place didn't have enough money to heat it last winter. So I don't think there's going to be any massive data efforts going on here. But what the people who do have a lot of money is central banks. And believe it or not, central banks actually care about this. And in some countries, they are the ones who keep the data. So that would be a kind of a cool thing. I wrote a paper for the ECB forum 2 years ago about how this trade in services would depress the price of services, just like China trade did. But the trouble was there was no prices for service data. No one. That wasn't me. I couldn't find it. I talked to OECD people. They didn't exist. And I was suggesting that they go out and get somebody to build these things, because obviously in the domestic accounts, we have price indices for services, because services are so important in GDP and you want to adjust it for inflation. So they must exist. It's just nobody's put them together. So that would be the first thing. But I think also the standards, and Jane will go along with me here, the classifications that exist in services are so archaic, it's ridiculous, and so aggregate. And so somebody should just, I think, when was the last revision? This BOP 6 or something, long time ago. So, and that was the UN who led that. So maybe a bunch of people doing it together. But WTO, I doubt it right away. Let me just put in one more division, and that's B2C and B2B. In this house, we do mode 1, 2, 3, 4. If you go up to Brussels, they have mode 5 as well. And but it really makes a big difference whether you're selling it to a consumer or producer. And I've never seen statistics broken down that way.
Great. Jennifer, just for a warning, I'll ask you the question on the WTO, what role the WTO can play. Jane, I noticed you were dying to come in. How do you think we should address some of the barriers that obviously do exist? How do we get beyond them?
Well, kind of wanted to answer Richard's question along with him and put my twist on it. So thank you. I mean, look, the barriers to digital services, any measure that might block or restrict or prejudice client access to what? Online searching, online ordering, online payment, online receipt of the service, or any transfer of data associated with any of those things. Now, traditionally, the bulk of barriers for services are behind the border. They're in regulatory regimes, right? And in digital standards or lack of them. So, so all cybersecurity or privacy regulations can impact almost the whole lot. And if we're talking about personal data privacy, then that will only impact on personal data flows. It's very, very important, obviously, in financial services, in education or health services or anything else where it's personal, individual data that's flowing. So all of them are subject to privacy and cybersecurity restrictions. Now, I do want to say, because, you know, 8 years ago, I started to tell Richard that his hypothesis would fall down if the barriers to trade got too much worse. And originally, and back when we first talked about it, it was mainly privacy and cyber, and it still is, but it's also e-identity and e-authentication, which has become really important now. And again, that's personal data. So the important thing here is that we can measure these barriers. The OECD's Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index is the one of the keys, provides insights that tracks most of them, including IP and digital infrastructure, connectivity, e-transactions, e-payments, etc., and barriers to competition. Sadly, the index shows that in the last 10 years, these restrictions increased by 25%. 25%. And increasing numbers of those restrictions are impacting, in particular, connectivity, including restrictions on cross-border data flows and data localization. And by early 2023, there were already 100 just data localization measures just across 40 odd countries. I mean, and more than half of them had emerged in the last decade. And those restrictions have been getting more restrictive. And 2/3 of them involve a local data storage and processing requirement, the most restrictive of all the barriers. So the OECD's been estimating that just a 0.1% reduction in that DSTRI, your own country's DSTRI, can deliver a cut in export costs in digital services of nearly 20%. Every 0.1 reduction, 20% trade cost reduction. Now, in digitally delivered services specifically, it's a 32% cut. So all of our governments clearly need to be getting on with a domestic digital regulatory agenda, reform agenda. They need, frankly, less policy space, not more. But there is another problem. Trading partners' digital regulatory regimes are diverging, and the divergence is growing, as Jennifer has highlighted, to the point where most businesses, and especially MSMEs, would agree that the heavy compliance costs associated with that divergence means the digital regulatory divergence all by itself is the biggest barrier to digital services trade. And I just want to say that what that means is that for services firms, while digital regulatory reform at home is top of mind every day, because frankly, the Trade Ministry is rarely at that table. It's hard to get it around the cybersecurity table and difficult on everything. It's a bad time these days, but trade's dropped to the bottom of the policy agenda. Trade ministers can't get much through most cabinets these days. It's vitally important that we all advocate for ongoing services DOM-Reg reform. But I've been, I wanted to explain that no one country can do this alone, because the key is that regulatory divergence. This really calls for getting all your trading partners to the table. And I've been warning Richard for years that these barriers are on the rise. So the question I wanted to address today, and my twist on this is, so is the hypothesis at risk? And what I want to say is that wage arbitration is arbitrage is still the key thing, but where the point is that digital services workers and entrepreneurs will thrive in locations where domestic digital regulation is efficient, consistent with best practice, and convergent with regulatory regimes in trading partners. There's no point building a data center if the regulatory regime is less robust. And where this is the case, then regulatory compliance costs and associated trade costs will be lower than elsewhere, and the location of thriving digital hubs will be more attracted to those locations. What that means is that regulatory arbitrage is becoming extremely important. Another reason to have everyone on the same page. And that's why I really feel it's taken a long time for trade policy makers to grapple with these issues. We've got to work at home, as always. Trade policy is always made at home, but we've also got to be building together the digital rules of the road. And that's why I'm so pleased about the July agreement on e-commerce. And really, honestly, the most important thing right now, because the OECD is telling us that agreement, implementing that very first stage base of trade facilitation material, can deliver a 30% increase in digital market openness. So my conclusion, Richard, is if we can lock that into the WTO system, we all have a chance of hanging on to your hypothesis for the future.
I'm all
Great.
for that.
And I want to bring in Emily on this point, because I know that you think about this question a lot as well. Like, if the digital trade space is global, but policy making is happening at a national level, how do we move forward?
Thank you so much.
And I want to have some time for a few questions, so I'm going to ask both of you to really keep it brief.
So I'll be very brief, but I also want to flip something on its head a little bit. I think we always talk about barriers to services trade and digital trade. And I actually think we need an enabling environment for digital that is based on trust, but that's got to be trust of our societies, of our consumers, of our workers in that digital environment. I think that means that we need robust data standards for personal data protection. And I think part of the reason that consumers are concerned about participating is they don't know how their personal data is going to be protected. Similarly, cybersecurity, incredibly important to make sure we've got really robust cybersecurity rules. Consumer protection. I mean, we're now in a position where, 20 years ago, firms traded. Now individual consumers can buy across borders, right? Yes. As Richard's mentioned, you've got individual freelance workers working across borders. And we need to have cross-border consumer redress. We talk about that very little, but we don't have consumer protection. It's a national thing. Labor protection is really national. And we're now in a world where we've got kind of globalized labor markets in effect. So we've got to really up the regulatory game, actually, I think, and re-regulate and fairly regulate quite a lot of these spaces. The AI, the digital technologies, we need robust data center regulation. You have a big data center go down somewhere, you've got fragility. So I actually think the question is, how do we very sensibly re-regulate some of these areas that have got too little regulation at the moment to enhance trust, and so that we can actually then have everybody participating and in a more inclusive way. That doesn't, and I agree with Jane on the question of regulatory fragmentation, because that is the challenge then. And societies do have different preferences. So it's genuinely hard on some of these areas. But then I think trying to get convergence where we can. But I would like to see more regulation, not less, in many of these areas. But I think it's about doing that in a coordinated fashion, leaving some flexibility for national discretion, but really upping our regulatory game.
More coordination. This sounds like the place where you can coordinate more. Jennifer, what role for the WTO?
Well, I'll only say thank you to my colleagues for making the point that I think at some level it has to come back to here, but it's very hard to think about how to do this at the WTO, in part because digital services crosses a lot of the disciplines and a lot of the underlying agreements. It doesn't fall neatly into a given, again, you have digitally enabled purchases of goods. So digital affects goods. Digital is a service, so it gets implicated by the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Digital often involves intellectual property, so it touches on the IP rules. You think about it across the board, it doesn't fit neatly within the WTO's framework or governance structure or committee structure or negotiating structure or any of that. So you start with how difficult that's going to be, and then you add into it, the fact that if you look at it, a lot of the innovation and the good ideas and the rule writing and the regulatory mechanisms are not taking place here. They're already being written heavily in Asia. I mean, I think as Jane has said, Asia has been one of the real leaders on a lot of the international the rules on it. And the EU has been a leader on, like I said, on privacy and on digital markets. So the rules are already sort of being written elsewhere, not in the WTO, not under this structure. So the real challenge is how much WTO members are willing to allow these flowers that are blooming all over to become some of the baseline standards, and yet to move ahead with an agreement that actually does, again, no harm in terms of do not add to the problems of the lack of regulatory conversion, because the worst thing that you can have is a non-interoperable system. If one person's e-signature cannot recognize another e-signature, again, just think about it. If one, customs declarations, customs declaration cannot be read somewhere else, you've actually caused harm rather than good. So, again, I do think it's a problem. I think it is really important that the WTO do it. I'm just saying I don't think it's an easy solution, but it is an essential one.
But it could start in a way as being a repository to bring in all these different ideas or initiatives that are being developed as a sort of a clearinghouse. But that's me. There are questions. Great. We started a couple of minutes late. So let's see if we can do 3 very quick questions with 3 very quick answers. I see the gentleman over there, the gentleman all the way in the back, and the sir who still has his hand up. Are there any women that have questions? Because then I'll give you a preference. All right, sir.
Yes, Mohammed Al-Mashari from International Chamber of Commerce, Saudi Arabia. What's your advice for us in Saudi Arabia and in the MENA area into entering the global digital service industry? Because you were talking about different regions, Asia, Latin America, but the MENA area or Saudi Arabia, what's your advice for us to be a part of that? Thank you. And especially the youth, our youth.
So advice for the MENA region. The sir in the back, yes.
I want to explore a little more the forecast for the growth of trade in service.
Sorry, can you recognize yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm Fabio Pupo for Folha de São Paulo. So I want to explore a little more the forecast to the growth of trade in services to find out which specific service segments you believe are likely to be the big winners from this potential growth of trade in services, and which of these segments could be the biggest job creators.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Last question for that gentleman.
Thank you. Tilman Kupfer from Popel Consult. One point to follow up on Jennifer Hillman. I mean, there's a nice paper from the Jacques Delors Institute, which showcases how the EU is actually leading in digital trade. Sorry, but also is very, very successful in exporting its regulatory regime through trade agreements, not only through the Brussels effect. And another one is about the issue of divergence, with which Jane highlighted, and looking at the UK and the EU, because I mean, so far the UK tried to align pretty much with the EU, in particular also when it comes to data protection. But there's also the problem of passive divergence. because the EU is moving ahead with its regulatory regime, like also with the AI Act, and whereas the UK is somehow standing behind. So how serious do you see that problem for the UK? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the last question first, and then Richard, could you address the question on which services segments are prone to be the winners? And then I'm going to look to who for the MENA? All right. Excellent. Emily?
Yeah, great. And I'm gonna, since there was no woman asked question, I'm gonna ask a question to Richard as well. Which was just the question of, for OECD countries, it's really interesting thought that we've had this hollowing out of our labor markets, and just whether the services, the intermediate services moving to the global south actually exacerbate some of the challenges we've got with inequality in the global north countries. On this question of passive divergence, yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the EU's moved, for example, the Platform Workers Directive, the EU's AI Act, and there's areas where the UK hasn't moved. I think that there's now concern that the UK needs to move, right? So I think on some of these areas, there will be growing calls for the UK to regulate. And the question then becomes, to what extent can you even meaningfully diverge? So I think it's one thing not to have, for example, stringent AI regulations, but as we now move to develop more robust AI regulations, I think it's going to be hard for UK firms to then have the next door, you know, as every other country, you know, the EU next door. So I think the EU will become the default, as it is for many, many countries. And I think the concern I have on a global level, with the EU being the sort of regulatory first mover and everybody else finding it hard to then go their own way, is that the EU's rules are not necessarily robust tested, for example, with African countries or Latin America. They're not necessarily fit for those jurisdictions, which is why it's so important we have a global dialogue, not that we're waiting for one major market to move and then you've got firms pressuring everybody else to converge. It would be much healthier if we could widen that global regulatory discussion, and think more globally about it.
Great. Richard, which services segments are going to be winners? Hairdressers or financial transactions?
So I haven't invested heavily in making actual projections, but I'll tell you how I would go about it if I was going to do that. I would just look at which ones have grown quickly in the last 5 or 10 years, because that's evidence that the barriers that aren't there. Because what's been happening is, because of COVID, companies all around the world got used to handling remote teams and delivering services remotely. And that has led them to hire more international teams. So whatever those are, you know, there's like other business services, there's the ones that are growing fastest will continue growing fastest. That's what I would leave with that. And it's kind of a coward's answer, but I think other than that, you'd have to put up great big models with elasticities we don't know, and then it would be all made up. So just project what's going on. So with Emily, so I wrote a book where the second word in the title was upheaval. But I was talking about the automation of services in rich countries and the offshoring of services in rich countries, hitting the same jobs at the same time, leading to an upheaval. And that so far hasn't happened so much. Maybe COVID confused everything. But I do think at some point people will be looking on the screen and seeing people are earning 1/10 of what they are, not asking for, you know, annual leave, not asking for, not having expensive housing, and get upset about it. But so far not.
And the last question for you, Jane, on what advice for the MENA region, particularly also the youth?
Oh, I didn't hear the youth bit. Okay, sorry. Okay, well, first of all, like any part of the world, it's always start with telecoms, because liberalization of telecoms and adequate digital infrastructure is the starting point and a takeoff point for everything else. With respect to the Gulf cooperation countries, for example, are players in the JSI on e-commerce, and they are, you know, they are making progress on precisely all the issues that I think matter and are important. And many of them are negotiating free trade agreements that include, whether they're called e-commerce chapters or digital trade chapters in those FTAs hardly matters anymore. We're covering the material that's necessary and building the regulatory cooperation in readily doable doses, if you like. The Continental Africa Free Trade Agreement that is deal on digital is remarkable. In some ways, it's a cut and paste from the e-commerce agreement. I mean, the template is taking root, and that's why I think it's so important. I think I don't think we should go on talking about there are no rules of the road. They've just been written, frankly. There's minimal to no celebration going on because governments are being cagey. Ministers haven't made announcements, and we all know the reasons for that. But the fact is that a serious start has been made. We've got an outcome. We've got an outcome, and those that are participating should start implementing it. This is the domestic work that has to be done in the regulatory arena. I would say youth, because I hadn't heard that. Youth and women are often handled in the same category, because when you look at the gig economy and at the entrepreneurial ecosystems and startups around us, the role of youth is phenomenal. I mean, the unicorns are coming from 17-year-olds. And it's very important to encourage the flourishing of a pro-innovation, pro-trade environment, because those innovation systems have to be open to the rest of the world, or the investment partners don't come. The connectivity with the rest of the world and the client base doesn't come. But youth are really out there in generating the apps that are going to the MSMEs and meeting global demand and growing. So I just thought it was remarkable. Telecom's story, for example, in Asia, both Vanuatu and Nepal, when they graduated from LDC status, and you have a look why. Why? Because they opened up their telecom sectors, and their services sectors, digital services sectors took off, and Nepal's DSTRI is down around OECD average. I mean, the case studies are there, and but in the MENA area, there's huge possibility for growth, huge.
So we've eaten a little bit of the time that you might be spending at a drinks reception or a dinner, and it's been a long day, but not before I give the final word to Jennifer.
I was only going to say, okay, I took 3 takeaways from this discussion, at least. For me, it is the huge promise that digital services offers for development, because it will allow, again, massive growth in a lot of the developing economies, but it requires that we not put up more barriers and that we figure out a way to have regulation really work. And my 3rd takeaway is the United States needs to get back in the game. That would be it.
Hear, hear. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining this discussion. It's been absolutely, Emily Jones, Jennifer Hillman, Jane Drake Buckman, and Richard Baldwin. Thanks.